They lied to you about spiritual awakening. Every guru, every book, every meditation app promised you that enlightenment would bring eternal peace, blissful happiness, and an end to suffering. But Carl Jung, the revolutionary psychologist who mapped the human psyche like no one before him, discovered something far more disturbing. He found that spiritual awakening isn't the beautiful destination everyone promised. It's actually the beginning of the most challenging journey of your life. What I'm about to reveal will shatter every comfortable belief you have about enlightenment. Jung's research uncovered 8 brutal truths about life after awakening that no one talks about, truths so unsettling that most spiritual teachers refuse to acknowledge them. These aren't feel-good platitudes or inspiring mantras. These are the raw, unfiltered realities that await anyone who dares to truly wake up. If you're ready to face the truth about what spiritual awakening really means, not the fairy tale version, but Jung's unflinching psychological reality, then hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell right now. Because what you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about consciousness, growth, and what it actually means to be awake in this world. The first brutal truth Jung discovered is that every relationship in your life will fundamentally change or die after spiritual awakening. This isn't metaphorical death. This is the literal end of relationships as you knew them. When you begin to see through the illusions that most people live by, when you stop participating in the collective unconscious patterns that bind society together, you become incompatible with your former life. Jung called this the problem of opposites. Before awakening, you could relate to others through shared illusions, common complaints, and mutual unconsciousness. You bonded over drama, gossip, surface-level concerns, and the comfortable lies that make ordinary life bearable. But after awakening, these connections become impossible to maintain authentically. Your family will accuse you of becoming cold or distant when you stop enabling their dysfunction. Friends will drift away when you no longer participate in their endless cycles of drama and victimhood. Romantic relationships will crumble when your partner realizes you're no longer the same person they fell in love with. Even your relationship with yourself dies. The person you thought you were simply ceases to exist. This isn't because you become superior or judgmental. It's because awakening creates what Jung termed differentiation. You become fundamentally different in how you perceive and interact with reality. You can't unsee what you've seen or unknow what you've learned. The innocent, unconscious version of yourself who could participate in collective delusions is gone forever. Most people experiencing this phase panic and try to force their old relationships to work, leading to immense suffering for everyone involved. They attempt to shrink themselves back down, to become unconscious again, to fit into relationships that no longer serve their evolved consciousness. But Jung warned that this regression is impossible. Consciousness, once expanded, cannot contract without severe psychological damage. The second brutal truth that Jung uncovered is that the dark night of the soul isn't a one-time event. It returns cyclically, often more intensely than before awakening. Most spiritual seekers believe that once they've experienced their initial dark night and emerged into the light, they're done with suffering. This is perhaps the most dangerous misconception in all of spirituality. Jung discovered through his own psychological breakdown and subsequent recovery that what he called the confrontation with the unconscious is not a linear process with a clear beginning and end. Instead, it's a spiral journey where you repeatedly descend into deeper layers of darkness, each time confronting more sophisticated and challenging aspects of your psyche. After awakening, your consciousness becomes more sensitive, more aware, more finely tuned to both light and shadow. This heightened sensitivity means that when the dark periods return, and they will return, you experience them with an intensity that can be overwhelming. You feel the world's pain more acutely. You perceive the depths of human suffering with crystalline clarity. You become aware of cosmic loneliness and existential terror that most people successfully avoid through unconsciousness. What makes this particularly brutal is that you can no longer use the old coping mechanisms that once provided comfort. Alcohol, drugs, mindless entertainment, shopping, casual relationships, and other forms of spiritual bypassing no longer work. Your awakened consciousness sees through these distractions immediately. You're left naked and exposed to the full intensity of existence without the protective buffer of unconsciousness. Jung called this the privilege of pain, the understanding that those who wake up must bear a greater share of consciousness, and with it, a greater capacity for both suffering and transformation. Each return to the darkness isn't a failure or regression. It's an initiation into deeper levels of awareness and responsibility. The cycles become more subtle but more profound. Instead of obvious external crises, you might experience existential emptiness, cosmic loneliness, or what Jung termed the transcendent functions demand. The psychological pressure to continuously evolve and integrate opposing forces within your psyche. These aren't problems to be solved, but ongoing conditions of awakened consciousness. Most people at this stage either try to spiritual bypass their way out of the darkness through positive thinking and denial, or they become convinced they're going backwards in their spiritual development. Neither response serves the awakening process. Jung taught that embracing these cycles as necessary components of consciousness expansion is essential for genuine psychological and spiritual maturity. The return of darkness isn't evidence that awakening was fake or that you failed. It's proof that you're evolving beyond the simplistic notion of enlightenment as permanent bliss into the more complex reality of consciousness as an ongoing, ever-deepening process of becoming. The third brutal truth Jung discovered is that everything becomes unbearably meaningful after awakening. This might sound like a gift, but it quickly becomes a psychological burden that most people are unprepared to carry. When your consciousness expands beyond ordinary perception, you begin to see the interconnectedness of all things, the symbolic significance of every event, and the deeper patterns underlying seemingly random occurrences. Jung called this the activation of the transcendent function, the ability to perceive meaning where others see only chaos or coincidence. Every conversation becomes loaded with psychological significance. Every relationship reveals archetypal patterns. Every challenge presents itself as a precisely designed lesson for your evolution. Nothing feels random anymore, and this constant awareness of meaning can become overwhelming. Before awakening, you could dismiss difficult experiences as bad luck or unfortunate circumstances. You could watch the news without feeling personally responsible for the world's suffering. You could observe other people's dysfunction without recognizing your own shadow projections. But after awakening, this protective ignorance disappears. You see your complicity in every dynamic, your responsibility for every interaction, and your connection to every form of suffering on the planet. This hyper-awareness of meaning extends to your dreams, which become incredibly vivid and symbolically rich. Jung spent decades analyzing his own dreams and discovered that after psychological awakening, the unconscious begins communicating more directly and intensely through dream imagery. What once might have been simple dreams become complex initiations, profound teachings, and sometimes terrifying confrontations with aspects of your psyche you didn't know existed. Synchronicities multiply exponentially, creating what Jung termed meaningful coincidences that feel like messages from the universe itself. While this can be initially exciting, it quickly becomes exhausting when every license plate, overheard conversation, and chance encounter seems to carry personal significance. You find yourself constantly trying to decode reality instead of simply living it. The burden of meaning also extends to your past, as awakening often triggers what Jung called retrospective illumination. Suddenly, every painful experience, every relationship, every mistake makes perfect sense as part of your soul's curriculum. While this can bring healing and understanding, it can also create overwhelming guilt and regret as you see how unconsciously you operated for so many years. Perhaps most challenging is the recognition that your suffering serves a purpose beyond your personal growth. Jung believed that individuals who undergo genuine awakening become what he called carriers of consciousness for the collective. Your pain isn't just your pain, it's humanity's pain working through you for transformation. Your healing isn't just for you, it's for the healing of the collective unconscious. This cosmic perspective on meaning and purpose can leave you feeling like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders, because in a very real psychological sense, you are. The fourth brutal truth Jung uncovered is that your greatest gifts will begin to feel like curses. After awakening, the very abilities that once brought you joy and purpose often become sources of profound isolation and burden. Your heightened intuition means you can see through people's facades, but this gift becomes torturous when you're surrounded by deception and self-delusion. Your expanded empathy allows you to feel others' pain deeply, but this sensitivity becomes overwhelming in a world full of suffering. Jung experienced this personally when his psychological insights, which had brought him professional success and recognition, began to feel like a curse. He could see the unconscious patterns playing out in every person he encountered, but this knowledge often left him feeling isolated from genuine human connection. He wrote extensively about what he called the curse of consciousness, the way that expanded awareness can become a prison of its own making. If you're naturally intuitive, awakening amplifies this gift to the point where you can read people's energy, motivations, and unconscious patterns with startling accuracy. But this ability becomes a burden when you realize that most people don't want to be seen so clearly, and your insights often make others uncomfortable. You find yourself constantly editing your perceptions to maintain relationships, which creates internal tension and authenticity conflicts. Creative gifts also transform in challenging ways. Artists, writers, and musicians often find that their creative process becomes more intense, but also more demanding after awakening. The muse that once brought inspiration now demands nothing less than complete truth and authenticity. You can no longer create superficial work or art that doesn't serve consciousness expansion. This higher standard can make the creative process feel like a relentless taskmaster rather than a source of joy. Healing abilities, whether developed through training or naturally emerging through awakening, become particularly burdensome. You begin to see the pain and dysfunction in everyone around you, and you feel compelled to help. But Jung discovered that this compulsion to heal others often stems from the helper's own unconscious need to avoid their personal shadow work. The gift becomes a distraction from your own continued evolution. Perhaps most challenging is the gift of seeing truth clearly. After awakening, you can no longer participate in collective illusions or social pretenses that once made life comfortable. You see through marketing manipulation, political theater, and social conditioning with uncomfortable clarity. This gift of discernment, while valuable, often leaves you feeling like an alien in your own culture. Jung called this phenomenon the differentiation problem. Your gifts don't disappear after awakening. They become more refined and powerful, but they also become more isolating because they separate you from unconscious participation in collective life. You become what he termed a conscious individual, someone who can no longer merge unconsciously with groupthink or mass consciousness. The tragedy is that the very abilities that make you uniquely valuable to the world also make it harder to find your place within it. The fifth brutal truth Jung discovered is that loneliness transforms into something cosmic and almost unbearable after awakening. This isn't the ordinary loneliness of lacking social connections. This is what Jung called metaphysical isolation, a recognition that consciousness itself is fundamentally alone in its journey toward individuation and self-realization. Before awakening, loneliness could be solved by finding like-minded people, joining communities, or forming intimate relationships. But after awakening, you realize that every conscious being is ultimately walking their path alone, and no amount of external connection can bridge the fundamental gap between individual consciousness and the mystery of existence itself. This recognition can be devastating for those who expected spiritual growth to lead to greater unity and connection. Jung experienced this cosmic loneliness intensely during his own confrontation with the unconscious. He wrote about feeling completely isolated in his psychological discoveries, unable to share the depth of his insights with even his closest colleagues and friends. He realized that each person must make their own journey into the depths of their psyche, and no one can do this work for another, or even fully understand another's experience of it. After awakening, you begin to understand what Jung meant when he said that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. You realize that self-acceptance isn't just about embracing your personality quirks or past mistakes. It's about accepting your ultimate aloneness in the universe and your responsibility for creating meaning in what might be an inherently meaningless existence. This cosmic loneliness is amplified by the fact that most people around you are still operating from unconscious patterns, making genuine connection increasingly rare. You find yourself surrounded by people but feeling profoundly alone because you can no longer engage authentically in surface-level interactions or participate in collective unconscious behaviors. The gap between your internal reality and the external world becomes a chasm. If you've made it this far in understanding Jung's brutal truths about awakening, you're clearly someone who values deep psychological insights over comfortable illusions. Make sure you subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell, because we're going to continue exploring the most challenging aspects of consciousness expansion that no one else is willing to discuss. Your journey into authentic awakening depends on understanding these realities. The cosmic nature of this loneliness also stems from what Jung called the God image problem. After awakening, you often lose the comfort of traditional religious beliefs, while not yet having developed a mature relationship with the transcendent. You find yourself in a spiritual no man's land, too conscious for conventional religion, but not yet established in your own direct relationship with the divine mystery. This phase can last for years, creating a spiritual homelessness that's unlike anything you experienced before awakening. You're no longer satisfied with borrowed wisdom or secondhand spiritual experiences, but you haven't yet fully developed your own authentic spiritual practice and understanding. The final brutal truths Jung discovered complete the devastating reality of life after spiritual awakening. The sixth truth is that you cannot save anyone, no matter how clearly you see their patterns or how much you love them. This realization destroys the savior complex that drives many people towards spiritual seeking in the first place. You watch people you care about making destructive choices while being powerless to prevent their suffering, understanding that their pain is often necessary for their own awakening process. The seventh truth is perhaps the most insidious. The ego doesn't disappear after awakening. It evolves into its most dangerous and sophisticated form. Jung called this the spiritual ego, or the inflated ego. This evolved ego convinces you that you're enlightened while subtly maintaining all the same patterns of superiority, judgment, and separation as before. It's more dangerous because it's harder to detect and often masquerades as humility or spiritual wisdom. This spiritual ego can manifest as subtle condescension toward those who aren't awakened, a secret sense of being chosen or special, or an addiction to being the wise one who helps others. It creates what Jung termed psychological inflation, an unconscious identification with archetypal energies that makes you feel like you're channeling divine wisdom when you're actually projecting your own unconscious material onto others. The eighth and final brutal truth is that the journey never ends, it only accelerates. There is no final destination called enlightenment, where you can rest in permanent peace and understanding. Instead, Jung discovered that consciousness expansion is an endless spiral of deeper initiations, more challenging integrations, and increasingly subtle forms of self-deception to uncover and transcend. Each level of awakening reveals new layers of unconsciousness. Each integration of shadow material uncovers deeper shadow aspects. Each spiritual insight opens doorways to more profound mysteries and more demanding forms of psychological work. What begins as a search for peace and happiness becomes an relentless commitment to consciousness expansion that demands everything you have and then asks for more. Jung called this the endless analysis. The recognition that psychological and spiritual development is not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be lived. The goal shifts from achieving a final state of enlightenment to developing the capacity to remain conscious and responsive to whatever life presents, moment by moment, without the comfort of a fixed identity or permanent spiritual achievement. This acceleration can feel overwhelming because just when you think you've mastered one level of consciousness, life presents you with entirely new challenges that require you to expand beyond your current capacity. The universe seems to have an endless appetite for your growth, never allowing you to settle into a comfortable spiritual identity or rest on past achievements. Understanding these 8 brutal truths doesn't diminish the value of spiritual awakening. It simply prepares you for the real journey ahead. Jung's gift was his unflinching honesty about the true cost and ongoing demands of consciousness expansion. Those who can embrace these realities without spiritual bypassing or denial discover that authentic awakening, while challenging, leads to a depth of meaning and aliveness that makes every difficulty worthwhile.